In today's video, we will discuss mandatory minimums on the sentencing guidelines. Detailed information for mandatory minimums can be found in the General Instructions section on page 39. Mandatory minimums are located under the Sentencing Guidelines Recommendations section of the cover sheet, and users must enter in the mandatory minimum under the appropriate section depending on the worksheet that was completed. So what are mandatory minimums and how do they impact the sentencing guidelines? Mandatory minimums are statutory sentencing mandates that operate independently of the recommendations of the guidelines. They also supersede these recommendations. They are sentences that must be imposed and cannot be suspended. In other words, the guidelines recommendation falls below a mandatory minimum. The guidelines recommendation must be adjusted to reflect that mandatory minimum. Oftentimes, there are multiple mandatory minimums in a sentencing event. If that is the case, those mandatory minimums must run consecutively to one another and not concurrently. So let's take a look at an example. Here in this sentencing event, we have a robbery, firearm use in the commission of a felony first and second or subsequent, and attempted statutory burglary of a dwelling. There are in fact two mandatory minimums in this sentencing event, first of which is a 3-year mandatory minimum for the use of firearm first offense, and a 5-year mandatory minimum for use of firearm second or subsequent. Now, users have two resources available to them in order to identify mandatory minimums. First of which is Appendix B in the Guidelines Manual, and the second and most efficient would be the VCC book. Because guidelines users have the option of looking up offenses via alphabetical listing or statute in the VCC book, there is a column located on the far right-hand corner of that page that will identify any mandatory minimums associated with said offenses. So our example, firearm use in the commission of a felony first and second or subsequent, we find the 3- and 5-year mandatory minimum located in this column. Back to our example, after completing the guidelines, we end up on section C, complete the guidelines according to the rules, and we end up with a total score 78. Guidelines users will then refer to the section C recommendation table, and for a score of 78, the recommendation yields at the low end 4 years and 3 months, the midpoint 6 years and 6 months, and the high end 7 years and 8 months. Now, guidelines users who use Swift will have this recommendation automatically populated for you on the cover sheet. Keep in mind the two mandatory minimums we have with our example, 3-year and a 5-year mandatory minimum, require us to change the recommendation at the low end, midpoint, and high end to an 8-year mandatory minimum because each mandatory minimum must run consecutively to one another. So in summary, mandatory minimums are sentences that must be imposed and cannot be suspended. If the recommendation falls below a mandatory minimum, it must be adjusted to reflect that mandatory minimum. And when there are multiple mandatory minimums in a sentencing event, they must run consecutively to one another and not concurrently. So what's the mandatory minimum? In this example, we have a sentencing event that contains 1 count of possession of Schedule 1 or 2 drug with no mandatory minimum, and we have 2 counts of transport 1 ounce or more of a Schedule 1 or 2 drug into the Commonwealth, each having a 3-year mandatory minimum. After completing the guidelines, we receive a recommendation of 4 years at the low end, 5 years and 5 months at the midpoint, and 6 years and 7 months at the high end. Is there a mandatory minimum adjustment that needs to be made to the guidelines recommendation? For the answer, text VCSC man-min to 56512. Thank you for tuning into this video. As always, for any questions, contact us at 804-225-4398. Give us a text at 804-393-9588 or email any member at the Sentencing Commission, and we will be more than happy to assist you.